It began as an ordinary Friday evening. My best friend Luke was over, just like he always was. We were in the living room, chatting and laughing, when my stepmom, Evelyn, came down the stairs. At 63, she had a certain aura that commanded attention. I hadn't given it much thought in the past, but lately I'd noticed a change in her. How she dressed and the confidence in her demeanor, I could tell Evelyn knew exactly the kind of attention she commanded. Luke noticed it too. I saw how his eyes followed her whenever she moved around the house. He'd glance at me, but I didn't say anything. It wasn't something we talked about, even though we both felt it. That night, Evelyn wore a silk robe tied loosely around her waist, revealing just enough to make it hard to ignore. She came into the room holding 2 glasses of wine and smiled in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "You boys look like you're having fun," she said, handing us the glasses. "Mind if I join?" I glanced at Luke, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt, but neither of us said no. Evelyn sat between us on the couch, crossing her legs, the hem of her robe sliding up just a little. I tried to focus on the TV, but it was impossible to ignore the tension building in the room. Luke was stealing glances at her, and I couldn't help but notice how she seemed to enjoy the attention. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Evelyn leaned in, her voice low. "I've noticed how you two look at me sometimes," she said, her eyes flicking between us. My heart stopped. Luke and I exchanged nervous glances, but neither of us said anything. Evelyn smiled, her hand brushing against my leg, then moving to Luke's. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'm not offended. In fact, I've been thinking about it too." My mouth went dry. Luke's face was flushed, and I could see the mix of confusion and excitement in his eyes. Evelyn's hand lingered on Luke's thigh, her fingers tracing small circles. She was testing the waters, and it was working. "I know I'm older," she continued, her voice soft but seductive, "but that doesn't mean I don't still have desires. And I've noticed you both have got an interest." She smiled at Luke, then at me, her hand moving higher up Luke's leg. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. This was my stepmom. But there was something about the way she was looking at us, the way her touch made my skin tingle, that made it impossible to resist. Luke shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't move her hand away. Evelyn's eyes flickered with satisfaction as she leaned in closer, her breath warm against my ear. "I think it's time we stopped pretending," she whispered. "I can feel the tension between us. Why don't we explore it?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My stepmom, Evelyn, was suggesting something I had never even imagined, at least not consciously. And yet there was a part of me that had thought about it, the way she moved, the way she smiled, the subtle touches. She had been teasing us for weeks, and now it was all coming to a head. Before I could respond, Evelyn turned to Luke, her fingers tracing up his arm. "What do you think, Luke?" she asked, her voice low and inviting. Luke's breath hitched, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and desire. He looked at me as if seeking permission, but I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind screaming that this was wrong, but my body wasn't listening. "I don't know." Luke stammered, his voice shaky. Evelyn smiled, leaning closer to him, her lips inches from his ear. "Relax," she whispered, her hand moving up his chest, fingers teasing the edge of his shirt. "We're all adults here. Let's just enjoy the moment." Luke swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between me and Evelyn. He was clearly torn, but the temptation was too strong. Evelyn leaned in and kissed him softly on the neck, her lips barely brushing his skin. Luke let out a soft gasp, and I could see the way his body responded to her touch. He wasn't going to stop this. Neither was I. Evelyn pulled back slightly, her eyes dark with desire. She looked at me. "And what about you?" she asked, her hand now resting on my thigh. "I know you've thought about this too." I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, but then Evelyn leaned in, her lips brushing against mine, soft and slow at first. It was a tentative kiss, but when I didn't pull away, she deepened it, her hand sliding up my thigh as her other hand moved to Luke's leg again. I kissed her back, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. Her lips were soft, warm, and the way she kissed me made everything else fade away. I wasn't thinking about what was right or wrong anymore. All I could focus on was the way Evelyn's body pressed against mine. The way her touch sends shivers down my spine. Evelyn pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting mine. "Good boy," she whispered. Before turning back to Luke, she kissed him too. More confidently this time, her hand moving up his chest. I watched, transfixed, as she deepened the kiss, her body pressing closer to his. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the heat between us growing. Evelyn wasn't holding back anymore, and neither were we. She moved between us, her hands exploring our bodies, her lips moving from Luke to me and back again. The tension in the room had reached its peak, and there was no turning back. Evelyn's hands were everywhere, on my chest, on Luke's back, pulling us closer, guiding us into this strange, forbidden territory. Her touch was electric, sending waves of pleasure through me, and from the way Luke was breathing, I could tell he felt the same for what felt like ours. We were caught in a whirlwind of kisses, touches, and soft gasps. Evelyn was in control, leading us both, her hands and lips igniting, a fire inside me I hadn't known was there. My stepmom, this woman I had known for years, was now the center of my universe, and I couldn't think of anything else but her. At some point, I felt Evelyn's hand on my chest, pushing me back gently. I lay down on the couch, my breath coming in short gasps as she climbed on top of me. Her robe had fallen open slightly, revealing more of her body, and the sight of her made my pulse quicken. Evelyn leaned down, kissing me deeply, her hands moving up my arms as she pressed herself against me. Luke was beside us, watching, his eyes dark with desire. Evelyn turned to him, her hand reaching out, pulling him closer. She kissed him again, her body still pressed against mine, and I could feel the heat radiating off her. We were lost in the moment, the three of us tangled together, our breaths mingling, our bodies moving in sync. As Evelyn kissed Luke, her hands roamed over my chest, fingers tracing patterns that sent shivers down my spine. I closed my eyes, letting myself get lost in the sensation of her touch, the sound of her breathing, the way her body moved against mine. The minutes blurred together as the intensity between us built. Evelyn's kisses became more urgent, her touch more demanding, and I could feel the passion between us reaching its peak. Luke was right there with us, his hands exploring Evelyn's body, his lips finding her neck, her shoulders. Finally, Evelyn pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at both of us, her eyes filled with a kind of satisfaction I had never seen before. "You boys did well," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say, my mind was still spinning from everything that had happened. I glanced at Luke, who looked just as dazed as I felt. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and there was no going back now. Evelyn smiled, a knowing smile, and leaned in to kiss me one last time, soft and lingering. "I think we all needed that," she said, her voice full of contentment. She stood up, tying her robe loosely around her waist again, and walked out of the room without another word. Luke and I sat there in stunned silence, still trying to process everything that had just happened. After a long pause, Luke finally spoke, his voice shaky. "What just happened?" I shook my head, still in disbelief. "I don't know, man, I don't know." We both sat there for a while longer, the weight of what had just transpired settling over us. We had both known Evelyn was attractive, alluring even, but none of us had expected things to escalate the way they had tonight. And now that it was over, I couldn't help but wonder what this meant for us, for me and Luke, for me and Evelyn. We had crossed into a territory we could never come back from, and I had no idea what the consequences would be. As Luke finally stood up to leave, he looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and excitement. "You think this is going to happen again?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I could do was shrug, my mind still foggy from the whirlwind of what had just happened. Luke stood there for a second longer, waiting for me to say something, but I stayed silent. Finally, he just gave me a half nod and headed toward the door. As he opened it, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. "Let me know if anything happens, all right?" I nodded, still not sure what to say. "Yeah, sure." I dragged myself out of bed, not sure what to expect. As I went downstairs, the smell of coffee hit me, and there she was, Evelyn, in the kitchen, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, completely casual as if nothing had happened. She looked up when she saw me, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Morning," she said casually, like it was just another normal day. "Morning," I mumbled, not sure how to act around her now. My mind flashed back to the previous night, but Evelyn didn't seem the least bit fazed. She moved around the kitchen, making breakfast as if everything was perfectly fine. I stood there awkwardly, watching her. Finally, I couldn't take the tension anymore. "About last night," I started, but my voice trailed off, unsure how to even begin. Evelyn turned and gave me a knowing look, her smile softening. "I figured you'd be thinking about it," she said, leaning against the counter. "You don't need to worry." "How can I not worry?" I blurted out. What happened was. It was. Evelyn held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "I know. It was unexpected, but it doesn't have to be complicated. We're all adults, and we made a choice. We can leave it at that, or—" Her voice trailed off, and I noticed the way she tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking with mine. "We can explore it a bit more." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what I expected her to say, but it wasn't that. Evelyn wasn't treating this like a mistake. She wasn't acting like we had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Instead, she was calm, collected, like she had thought this through and was giving me an option. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter now, unsure of what I wanted the answer to be. Evelyn moved closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "If you're interested, if Luke is interested, we don't have to stop here." Her hand gently touched my arm, the same warmth I had felt last night surging through me again. "There's no need to make things awkward, unless you choose to." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Was this really an option? Could this really continue? And if it did, what did that mean for all of us? Before I could answer, the sound of my phone buzzing broke the moment. I glanced down to see a text from Luke. "Hey man, what's going on?" Evelyn saw the message too, and a small smile curled at the corners of her lips. "Looks like Luke's curious," she said softly. "Maybe he's wondering if last night was a one-time thing." I stared at the text, my thoughts swirling. Part of me wanted to say it was all over. That last night was a mistake we could chalk up to too much wine and a moment of weakness. But another part of me, the part that had been caught up in Evelyn's touch, her kiss, the way she made me feel, wasn't so sure. Without really thinking, I responded to Luke's text. "You free later? We should talk." Luke came over that afternoon, and as soon as you walked in, I could tell he was just as confused as I was. He avoided eye contact at first, looking around the house like he was half expecting Evelyn to appear at any second. "So, what the hell happened last night?" he finally asked, his voice low and unsure. I leaned back on the couch, trying to find the right words. "I don't know, man. It just happened." Luke sat down across from me, shaking his head. "Yeah, but that was your stepmom. We were both involved." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly still trying to wrap his head around it. I don't know what to make of it. I hesitated, not sure how much to say. Should I tell him about the conversation I'd had with Evelyn earlier? About how she had left the door open for us to continue? Whatever this was, before I could decide, Evelyn entered the room, her presence immediately commanding attention. She looked at Luke, then at me, and smiled. "Hey, Luke," she greeted him softly, her voice smooth. "I was hoping we could talk." Luke's eyes widened slightly as he glanced at me, clearly unsure of what was about to happen. Evelyn sat down beside me, her hand lightly brushing my knee before turning her attention to Luke. "I know last night was unexpected," she began, her tone calm and steady, "but I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. I don't want things to be weird between us. What happened last night doesn't have to be a one-time thing, but only if it's something you both want." Luke blinked, clearly taken aback by how straightforward she was being. He looked at me, and I could see the confusion in his eyes, but there was also something else, a flicker of curiosity, of desire, the same feelings I had been wrestling with all day. Evelyn continued, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not asking for anything serious. This doesn't need to be complicated. I'm offering you both something different, something exciting, but only if you're both comfortable with it. There was a long pause as Luke and I exchanged glances trying to process what Evelyn was suggesting. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that made my pulse race and my mind spin. Finally, Luke spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "And if we say yes, what happens then?" Evelyn's smile widened slightly. "Then we see where it goes," she said simply. No pressure, no strings, just us. I could feel the electricity in the room as the three of us sat there at the weight of Evelyn's words sinking, and this was real. She was serious. And now the choice was in our hands. Luke looked at me again, his eyes searching for some kind of confirmation, some sign of what I was thinking. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't want to say no. The part of me that had been fighting this, the part that was scared of what it all meant, was losing the battle to the part of me that wanted more. I nodded slowly, my heart racing. "I'm in," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through me. Luke hesitated for a moment longer, but then he nodded too. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm. "I'm in." Evelyn smiled, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She stood up and took a step toward Luke, her hand reaching out to touch his arm.
"Good," she whispered.
"Let's not waste any more time." She leaned in and kissed him softly, her lips lingering on as for just a moment before pulling away. Then she turned to me, her eyes full of promise as she leaned down and kissed me to the same soft lingering kiss that sent a shiver down my spine. As Evelyn pulled back, she smiled at both of us, her gaze filled with the same intensity that had been there the night before. "Now," she said softly, "let's continue what we started." The rest of the afternoon blurred together in our whirlwind of sensations, kisses, touches, the heat of our bodies pressed together as we explored this new and forbidden territory. Evelyn was in control, guiding us both, her touch igniting a fire in me that I hadn't known existed. Every time I thought we were pushing the boundaries too far, she would pull us back in, reassuring us with a kiss, a whisper, a touch. Luke and I found ourselves caught in the same current, our bodies moving in sync with Evelyn's, the tension between us building and building until it finally exploded in a moment of pure, undeniable passion. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just the three of us lost in the moment. As the intensity of our encounter faded, a new kind of tension settled over us. Luke, Evelyn, and I sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The room felt different now, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. I glanced at Luke, noticing the mix of confusion and satisfaction on his face. Evelyn, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, a small smile playing on her lips. While Evelyn said, breaking the silence, "I think we all needed that." Her voice was light, almost casual, as if what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't help but marvel at her composure. Luke cleared his throat, clearly struggling to find the right words. "Yeah, that was something," he mumbled, his eyes darting between Evelyn and me. I nodded, still trying to process everything. "So what now?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Evelyn stretched languidly, her movements drawing both Luke's and my attention. "Now," she said, "we go on with our lives, but with a little added excitement when we want it." She winked at us, and I felt a flutter in my stomach. Luke shifted uncomfortably. "But how does this work? I mean, we can't just, can we?" He looked at me, seeking some kind of reassurance or explanation. I shrugged, feeling just as lost as he was. Evelyn, sensing our uncertainty, leaned forward, her expression softening. "Boys," she said gently, "this only works if we're all comfortable. There's no pressure, no expectations. We can take this one day at a time." Her words seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Luke nodded slowly, and I found myself relaxing a bit too. "Okay," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "One day at a time." Evelyn beamed at us, her smile radiating warmth. "Exactly," she said. "Now, who's hungry? I think we could all use a good meal after all that exercise." We laughed, the sound breaking through the last of the awkwardness. As Evelyn stood to head to the kitchen, Luke and I exchanged glances. There was an understanding there, a shared experience that had changed our friendship in ways we were only beginning to understand. The days that followed were a strange mix of normalcy and surreal moments. Luke and I went about our usual routines: work, gym, hanging out. But there was always an undercurrent of anticipation, a shared secret that made even the most mundane interactions feel charged with possibility. Evelyn, for her part, seemed to revel in this new dynamic. She'd brush past me in the hallway, her touch lingering just a moment too long, or she'd catch Luke's eye across the room, giving him a look that made him blush furiously. It was a delicate dance, one that kept us all on our toes. About a week after our first encounter, Luke came over for our usual Friday night hangout. As we sat on the couch, beers in hand, the air felt thick with unspoken words. So Luke said finally, his voice low, "Have you and Evelyn, since that day?" I took a long swig of my beer, buying time before answering. "No," I admitted. Luke shook his head. "Nah, man. It's been driving me crazy though. I can't stop thinking about it." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "Yeah, me too." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared experience hanging between us. "Do you think it'll happen again?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, we heard the sound of heels on the hardwood floor. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, dressed in a way that made both our heads turn. "Evening, boys," she said, her voice low and sultry. "Room for one more." Luke and I exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between us. Without a word, we both nodded, making space for Evelyn on the couch. As she settled between us, her warmth radiating against my side, I realized that this was our new normal. This delicate balance of friendship, desire, and the thrill of the forbidden. It wasn't conventional. It wasn't what I ever expected my life to be. But as Evelyn's hand found mine, her other reaching for Luke, I knew that none of us wanted it any other way. The weeks turned into months, and our unconventional arrangement continued. We never talked about it outside of those heated moments, but it became an unspoken part of our lives. Sometimes it would be all three of us, other times just two. There were no rules, no expectations, just the understanding that what happened between us stayed between us. Luke and I's friendship changed too. There was a new level of intimacy, a shared secret that bound us together in ways we never expected. We became more open with each other, more honest about our feelings and desires. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of jealousy, of confusion, of guilt. But somehow, we always found our way back to each other, to this strange new family we had created. Evelyn, for her part, seemed to blossom in this new dynamic. She carried herself with a new confidence, a sparkle in her eye that hadn't been there before. She became not just my stepmom, but a friend, a confidant, someone who understood me in ways I never thought possible as the seasons changed. I found myself reflecting on how much my life had transformed. The initial shock and confusion had given way to a kind of contentment I never expected to find. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, of wondering if what we were doing was right. But then I'd catch Evelyn's eye across the room, or share a knowing smile with Luke, and I'd remember that sometimes happiness comes in the most unexpected packages one night. As the three of us lay tangled together, catching our breath, Evelyn propped herself up on one elbow, looking at Luke and me with a serious expression. "You know," she said softly, "I never expected this, but I wouldn't change it for the world." Luke nodded, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Me neither," he said. I looked at them both, these two people who had become so central to my life in such an unexpected way. "I love you both," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. But as soon as I said it, I knew it was true. It wasn't a conventional love. It wasn't something I could explain to anyone outside our little trio, but it was real, and it was ours. Evelyn leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "We love you too, sweetheart," she murmured. Luke nodded in agreement, his hand finding mine in the darkness. As we lay there, the three of us connected in this moment of vulnerability and truth. I realized that sometimes family is what you make it, and this, as unconventional as it was ours. The future was uncertain. I didn't know how long this could last or what challenges we might face, but as I drifted off to sleep, Evelyn on one side and Luke on the other, I knew that whatever came our way, we'd face it together. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life I had found. And despite all the complications, all the potential for heartbreak, I wouldn't have it any other way as dawn broke, casting a soft light through the window. I watched Evelyn and Luke sleeping peacefully. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns life had taken, for the love I had found in the most unlikely of places, and for the courage we had all shown in embracing this unconventional path. Whatever the future held, I knew that this chapter of my life would always be special. It had taught me about love, about acceptance, about the infinite possibilities of the human heart. And as I closed my eyes, letting sleep claim me once more, I smiled. This was my family now, unconventional, unexpected, but undeniably mine.